My daughter-in-law had a decorator in my late wife's kitchen measuring for new countertops before the funeral flowers even wilted. And 3 days later, my own son handed me a padlock for a storage unit and called it my inheritance. I opened that storage unit alone at midnight, half expecting to find nothing but junk. Instead, taped to the inside of an old tackle box, I found a single key, a phone number with no name attached, and 7 words in my wife's handwriting, for the only one who never asked for anything. When I finally understood what that key opened, I realized my son and daughter had just handed their father a loaded gun and dared him to leave it on the table. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments what state you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had family look right through you like you were already gone, hit that like button for me. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 68 years old, and up until 11 days ago, I thought I understood my own family. I was wrong about almost everything, except the woman I married. The funeral for my wife Margaret was held at Cedar Hollow Community Church outside Asheville, North Carolina, the same little brick building where we'd married 42 years earlier. Margaret had built Higgins Regional Freight from a single leased truck into a company that moved goods across 6 states, and half the town showed up to pay respects to the woman who'd given half of them their first job. I sat in the front pew in a suit I hadn't worn since our 40th anniversary, my hands folded, grief sitting on my chest like a sandbag. My son Dale stood by the door, shaking hands with our attorney and 2 of Margaret's old business partners, working the room like he was closing a deal. He didn't look like a man burying his mother. He looked like a man who'd just been handed a promotion. My daughter Renee sat 2 rows back with her husband Trent, and I watched Trent lean over and whisper something into her ear that made her smile at a funeral. Not a sad smile, a relieved one. Nobody asked how I was holding up. Nobody sat beside me. I was Margaret's husband, the way furniture belongs to a house expected, unremarkable, easy to walk past. They'd always seen me as the quiet one, the man who ran the loading docks while Margaret ran the empire. A decent enough fellow who got lucky marrying a woman with vision. What none of them knew, what only Margaret and I ever knew, was that 26 years ago, I sold my own construction supply company, every truck and every warehouse I owned, to keep Higgins Regional Freight from going under during a bad winter that nearly buried her in debt. I poured every dollar into stabilizing her business and rebuilding the fleet. I never asked for my name on the door. I liked watching her shine. But sitting in that pew, watching my children divide up her legacy with their eyes before her body was even in the ground, I understood that my silence all those years had let something ugly take root in both of them. 4 days after the funeral, we gathered at the house for the reading of the will. Our family attorney, a stiff man named Foster who'd handled Margaret's paperwork for 15 years, sat at the head of our dining table with a folder in front of him. Dale and Renee sat across from me, their spouses hovering behind their chairs like they were waiting for a verdict they already knew was in their favor. Foster read through the assets in a flat, practiced voice. The company itself, all 41 trucks, the 2 regional warehouses, the office building downtown, and the lake house on Norris Lake, all of it split evenly between Dale and Renee. Trent actually pumped his fist a little when the lake house was mentioned. Then Foster paused, looked at me over his glasses, and read the final line. To my husband Walter, I leave my eternal gratitude, and the storage unit on Route 9, Unit 114, along with the enclosed padlock key. Dale let out a short laugh before he could stop himself. A storage unit, he said, shaking his head like it was the punchline to a joke he'd been waiting all week to hear. Renee didn't laugh, but she didn't look surprised either. She reached across the table and patted my hand the way you'd pat a dog that had done something mildly disappointing. Dad, we're not going to leave you out in the cold, she said. Trent and I talked about it. We can set you up with $800 a month, plenty for a little apartment somewhere quiet. But we're going to need the master bedroom back. Trent's already got a designer coming out next week, and honestly, your recliner and all those fishing magazines are going to have to go into storage with the rest of your stuff. I looked at the 4 of them. Nobody said a word about missing their mother. Nobody asked if I'd eaten that day. $800 offered like alms. In the house I'd helped pay for with my own hands, by children I'd raised to ride bikes and throw baseballs. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I picked up the little padlock key Foster slid across the table, put it in my shirt pocket, and stood up without a word. I walked out of that dining room and left them to their celebration. I figured I'd have at least a week to catch my breath. Greed doesn't wait that long. 2 days later, I was out back trimming Margaret's rose bushes, the only place in that house that still felt like hers, when Renee came out onto the patio with a folder in her hand. Trent trailed behind her, holding a laser measuring tool, like a man eager to get to work. "It's a 30-day notice," Renee said, handing me the folder without meeting my eyes. "Trent's already got a contractor lined up to open the floor plan, and with the market the way it is, we really can't afford to wait. 30 days is standard, but if you could be out by the end of the week, that would honestly make everything easier on everybody. Easier on everybody except the man who'd slept in that house for 4 decades. I folded the eviction notice and put it in my back pocket. I didn't beg. I walked upstairs, pulled my old army duffel bag down from the closet shelf, and packed 3 changes of clothes, my shaving kit, and the framed photograph of Margaret from our trip to the Smokies the year we got married. I left the suits. I left the watches she'd bought me for our anniversaries. Dale was standing in the front hallway when I came down the stairs, arms crossed, that same smug half-smile on his face he used to wear when he beat me at checkers as a boy. "Leaving so soon, old man," he said. "Don't forget your keys on the table." I set them down without a sound and walked out the front door, down the gravel drive, while I heard the 2 of them laughing behind me on the porch, like I'd just handed them a victory. They had no idea what they'd just started. By nightfall, I was sitting on a lumpy mattress in the Pine Haven Motor Lodge off Highway 25, the kind of place with a flickering vacancy sign and a bathroom that smelled like bleach and cigarettes. I sat at a wobbly desk and pulled the little padlock key from my pocket, along with a folded slip of paper. Foster had also handed me quietly on his way out the storage unit address and combination for the outer gate. My hands were steadier than I expected. I drove out to the storage facility that same night, found Unit 114 in the dark rows of corrugated metal doors, and rolled it open with a squeal that echoed across the empty lot. Inside was almost nothing. An old fishing tackle box sitting on a folding table, and beside it, a single sealed envelope with my name written in Margaret's looping cursive. I sat down on an overturned bucket and opened the tackle box first. Taped to the inside lid was a small brass key, different from the padlock key, and a business card for a man named Arthur Callahan. No title, just a phone number. I opened the envelope next. The letter was short. I always knew who they'd become the second I stopped watching them. Margaret had written, "If you're reading this in a storage unit surrounded by junk, it means Dale and Renee failed the only test that ever mattered to me. The company they think they inherited is a shell. Walter, you are the roots. Call Arthur. He'll explain everything. This is for the only one who never asked me for anything." My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading. I called the number from the tackle box card that same night, even though it was well past 10. A calm voice answered on the second ring. "Higgins residence. This is Arthur Callahan." I told him who I was, and there was a pause on the line. Not confusion, but something closer to recognition, like a man who'd been waiting years for a phone call he hoped would never come. "Mr. Higgins," he said, "I am very sorry for your loss. Margaret was the sharpest client I've had in 30 years of practice, and she loved you more than she ever let those children see. I need you to come to my office first thing tomorrow. There's a great deal you don't know, and very little time to waste once your son and daughter start making decisions." I didn't sleep that night. Not from grief this time, but from a slow-burning current running under my skin that I hadn't felt since I was a young man building something from nothing. The next morning, I put on the same slacks and button-down I'd worn to breakfast the day before, walked into a diner 2 doors down from the motel, and tried to withdraw $60 from the ATM using the debit card linked to my and Margaret's joint checking account. The account that held my modest personal savings, the money I used for gas and groceries and Sunday church donations, declined. I tried again for $20, thinking I'd fat-fingered the PIN. Declined again, this time with a message telling me the account had been frozen pending a state review. I called the bank's customer service line right there on the sidewalk. The automated system finally connected me to a human who confirmed what I already suspected in my gut. My accounts had been frozen at the request of Dale, listed as executor of the estate. My own son had cut off my access to my own money less than 48 hours after I walked out that front door, and I understood exactly what he was doing. He wanted me hungry. He wanted me humiliated enough to call him up and beg for that $800 allowance, to come crawling back and thank him for his charity. I stood on that sidewalk, took my debit card out of my wallet, and snapped it in half with my thumbs. I didn't need their scraps. Arthur Callahan's office wasn't downtown in one of the glass buildings where Dale had set up his executive suite. It was a converted farmhouse, 20 minutes outside town. Quiet gravel drive. No sign out front. Arthur himself was a tall man in his 70s, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. The kind of man who'd clearly spent his career handling things quietly and thoroughly. He sat me down across a worn oak desk and got straight to business. "Your wife restructured this company 9 years ago," he told me, in a way that Dale and Renee have absolutely no idea exists. She created a parent holding entity Cedar Ridge Capital Partners and transferred every meaningful asset into it. The real estate, the fleet titles, the client contracts, the routing software Margaret had commissioned custom for the company, even the trademarked Higgins regional freight name itself. What Dale and Renee inherited is what's left over an operating shell that leases everything it uses to run day-to-day business from Cedar Ridge Capital. And who owns Cedar Ridge Capital, Mr. Higgins? You do. Every share of it, along with roughly $11 million sitting in a linked account that your children have never known existed. I sat back in that chair and had to ask him to repeat himself, because I genuinely thought I'd misheard. I hadn't. Margaret had quietly made me the landlord of my own children's entire livelihood, and neither of them had the faintest idea. Arthur explained that for years, Margaret had simply forgiven the licensing and lease payments the operating company technically owed Cedar Ridge, keeping the books clean and the business humming along without friction. But that forgiveness died with her. The debts were real, contractual, and enforceable, and if called in, they would bury the shell company within weeks. I asked him why Margaret had never told me, why she'd waited until she was gone to hand me this. Arthur's face went soft for the first time since I'd walked in. "She told me once," he said, "that if she told you while she was alive, you'd never let her go through with it. You'd talk her out of hurting the kids, even to protect the legacy. She wanted to give them one chance to prove they'd earned it. If they treated you with respect after her passing, if they welcomed you into the transition instead of pushing you out, this envelope would never have needed opening. You would have walked into a boardroom together, as a family. Instead, they evicted a grieving widower within 48 hours and froze his bank account to starve him into submission. She knew exactly who they were, Mr. Higgins. She was hoping she was wrong. I told Arthur I didn't want a war that dragged through courts for years. I wanted this handled cleanly, and I wanted my name kept off any paperwork until the moment mattered." He nodded, like he'd expected exactly that answer. "We'll send a routine notice," he said. "Something boring enough that they file it away and forget about it. Their arrogance will do the rest." That notice went out 3 days later, a plain white envelope demanding payment of 4 months' back rent and licensing fees on behalf of Cedar Ridge Capital Partners, totaling just under $900,000. It landed on Dale's desk between a stack of investor brochures and a lunch menu from the steakhouse he'd started frequenting. He barely glanced at it. He told his assistant it was probably some outdated paperwork glitch from his mother's old accounting system and tossed it into a drawer. Meanwhile, Renee had already put a down payment on a 38-foot pontoon boat using a company credit card. and Trent had quietly taken out a $400,000 personal line of credit against the downtown office building as collateral, a building he did not, in fact, own. Neither of them read the fine print on anything anymore. They'd stopped believing they needed to. I moved out of the motel and into a modest, extended-stay hotel Arthur arranged near his office, and I spent my days learning, for the first time in my life, exactly how much power Margaret had quietly built into my hands. 2 weeks after that first notice went unpaid, Arthur drafted a formal default letter. This one wasn't boring paperwork anymore. It stated plainly that Cedar Ridge Capital Partners was terminating all licensing agreements effective immediately, revoking the operating company's right to use the trademarked name, the routing software, and the leased vehicle fleet, unless the outstanding $900,000 was paid in full within 72 hours. I wanted to see my son's face when it landed, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I put on my oldest flannel shirt and the work boots I used for yard work, and I walked into the downtown office lobby looking exactly like the broken old man they believed they'd left behind. I told the receptionist I needed to speak with Dale. When he came down and saw me standing there, his face twisted with something between embarrassment and fury. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, glancing around at his employees. I told him, quiet and trembling, that my card had been declined at the grocery store, that I hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, that I needed the $800 he and Renee had promised. Dale laughed, loud enough that people in the lobby turned to look. "You actually thought that offer was real," he said. "That was us being polite about kicking you out. You didn't build this company, old man. You planted flowers and rode Mom's coattails for 40 years. Go find work if you're hungry." I let him say every word of it, my phone recording quietly in my shirt pocket the whole time, and when he finally had security walk me out, I stood on that sidewalk and played the recording back through my earbuds. Whatever fragile hope I'd been holding on to that my boy was simply lost, not cruel, evaporated in the length of that phone call. I turned around, called Arthur, and told him it was time. The 72 hours passed. Nobody paid the debt, because nobody at the operating company took it seriously enough to even show the notice to a lawyer. On the 73rd hour, a team of forensic auditors Arthur had retained walked into the downtown office and formally seized access to every server, every ledger, every filing cabinet, under the authority of Cedar Ridge Capital Partners. Dale assumed it was a random government audit and spent an entire panicked afternoon trying to have the auditors physically removed from the building, which only made things worse, since obstruction only added weight to the case quietly building against him. Cornered and desperate, Dale and Trent cooked up a scheme to secretly sell a portion of the truck fleet to a buyer out of state, routing the cash into personal accounts to cover the mounting debts nobody outside the family knew about yet. What they didn't realize was that Arthur had anticipated exactly this kind of desperation. The out-of-state buyer was a shell company controlled entirely by Cedar Ridge Capital, and the sale contract they rushed to sign in a cramped conference room outside Knoxville contained language explicitly acknowledging Cedar Ridge's superior legal claim over every asset involved, and admitting under signature that they were liquidating company property to cover personal debts. They signed their own confession without reading past the dollar figure. 2 days after that signing, I put on the charcoal suit Margaret had bought me years earlier for a wedding we'd attended together, a suit I hadn't worn since, and I walked into the downtown headquarters one final time. Dale and Renee had gathered the entire remaining staff and a handful of hand-picked board members for what they thought was going to be an announcement of a bold new restructuring plan. Instead, the doors opened and I walked in, flanked by Arthur Callahan on one side and the lead forensic auditor on the other. The room went dead silent. Dale's face drained of color the second he recognized me standing straight, dressed sharp. Nothing like the broken old man he'd thrown out of his lobby 2 weeks earlier. He tried to bluster through it, demanding to know how I'd gotten past security, calling me delusional in front of his own employees. Arthur didn't raise his voice once, He simply laid out the truth in plain terms that Dale and Renee had never owned the company they thought they inherited, that they'd been operating on borrowed time under a licensing structure that had already collapsed, and that their signatures on that fleet sale 2 nights earlier had handed Cedar Ridge Capital, and me, the final legal grounds to reclaim everything, immediately. I stepped forward and told my son, in a voice steadier than I'd used in years, that his mother hadn't left me a storage unit out of disrespect. She'd left it as the final test of who he and his sister had become, and they had failed it in the ugliest way imaginable. I told the room, loud enough for everyone to hear, that I wasn't there to beg for $800. I was there because I owned the ground beneath their feet, and I'd come to collect what was owed. What followed in the weeks after was a slow unraveling. I never took pleasure in watching, though I won't pretend it didn't feel like justice. The banks called in every personal loan the two of them had leveraged against assets that were never actually theirs. Trent's line of credit collapsed overnight, and he filed for divorce from Renee within the month, telling her flatly he wasn't going to let her financial mess drag him down with her. Dale's fiancée at the time packed her bags the same week the repossession trucks showed up for his truck and boat, leaving him a note instead of a goodbye. Within 6 weeks, both of my children had lost their homes, their spouses, and every ounce of the arrogance they'd worn like armor since the day their mother's casket was lowered into the ground. They showed up at the front gate of the old house 11 days after that boardroom, the house that was legally mine again now that the estate had fully settled in Cedar Ridge's favor. I stood on the other side of the wrought iron gate and looked at the two of them. Wrinkled clothes, hollow eyes, nothing left of the confidence they'd carried into that dining room the day the will was read. Dale begged first, his voice cracking, saying they had nowhere to go, that they were sorry, that they'd made a terrible mistake. Renee asked, through tears, if they could just have that $800 now, promising they'd disappear and never bother me again. I stood there a long moment, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, just a quiet, hollow emptiness, where my love for them used to sit. I told them that when they offered me that $800, it was never kindness. It was a bribe to make me disappear quietly so they could keep what they thought they'd earned. I told them that 30 years ago their mother and I started with nothing but a folding table and 2 working hands, and that survival was never something either of us inherited. It was something we built. I turned around and walked back up the driveway, and I didn't look back when I heard them calling my name through the bars of that gate. Family, I've come to understand, isn't the blood you share. It's the respect you choose to give each other when nobody's watching and nothing's being handed out. I stayed quiet my whole life, and I let people mistake that silence for weakness. I won't make that mistake again, and if you've ever had to draw a line with people who share your last name, I hope you'll tell me about it in the comments below. If this story meant something to you tonight, go ahead and subscribe, because there are more nights like this one still to come.